record on this computer. So going to kick it off real quick, just because I think that there's a good opportunity to collaborate on some of the stuff that we need to think about as we approach hosting Drupal and Kubernetes. So the basic outline for what's kind of on the agenda so far, as has been recommended from the Slack channel essentially, is in the chat box. I'm assuming that Zoom's going to pick that up, but we'll see. So basically, there's a couple of different ideas about how to go about open sourcing components of what we're going to use to host Drupal in different ways. It's a common problem that a lot of people are going to end up hitting. So kind of get the sense that it might be good to start a conversation around how we're going to do that and what that actually means. So I don't know, Jason, do you have any ideas or anything that you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think the absolute minimum to look at here is, I think we can borrow a bit off the model of the Kubernetes project itself, where we have upstream Kubernetes owned and managed by the Cloud Native Foundation, which has a fairly well thought out governance process. One of the goals there is to minimize as much provider specific sort of, and when I mean provider, I'm talking about cloud providers. So that would be like Google Cloud Platform or AWS. The idea is to create a core set of APIs and a common backend implementations for those core API objects that are pretty generic, and to have a rich, or to have the extensibility through APIs and well understood contracts for a cloud provider to be able to add their own Fire or feature set that will work well with the ecosystem. So I would say one high level goal I would say is we should look at defining at the very least a set of API resources which anyone can run like a open source operator controller implementation of. And to back up a little bit, when I talk about operators and controllers tend to be used interchangeably. Operator really defines an automation process around running a application. So a Drupal operator, a MySQL operator is the term there. And then the other component of that is the controller, which implements and acts on that API object that is defined. At the very least, I think defining the API objects, so identifying just what the core feature set that is relevant for Drupal, that is relevant for all that's common for whether or not you're hosting Drupal yourself on your own Kubernetes cluster, or if you are using a hosting provider that it seems based now on just talking with other providers that Kubernetes is either already being used extensively to host Drupal, or it is being rapidly adopted. So either the providers are either using it already or moving towards it. So the advantage, I would say, of us at least having a open sourced API definition, so custom resource definitions is what they're typically known as well as a open source. It will run, it's cloud provider agnostic for the most part. someone who really wants to go and manage a full platform or an operator on their own in their own Kubernetes cluster could, of course, use this to host Drupal on Kubernetes in a sustainable pattern. But then for providers, hosting providers that wants to be able to customize how they implement that API object to a degree, whether or not they are using a different storage provider, a different cloud provider, is able to either make modifications to the open source controllers, by forking it potentially, or by just writing their own implementation that they don't necessarily need to share, to the public on GitHub. A bit long-winded there, but that's one of the big high-level goals that I think that the Drupal community can really benefit from, and will make running Drupal on Kubernetes much more straightforward for the users who haven't spent a ton of time there, and then also get some convergence and sharing between the different hosting providers instead of all of us doing our own thing in very, very different ways. That makes it one thing I think everyone, all of the hosting providers, I think could potentially really benefit from is to make vendor lock not a huge part of a customer's decision. And that is one of the other big goals of Cloud Native Foundation, was to address that, and by addressing that, like the enterprise space especially is moving far, at a quicker pace into the cloud, because they're not sitting there scared, to pick like one of the three big providers and be afraid that they're picking the wrong provider, and that they're risking having to do a very expensive rewrite, refactor, or something like that because they need to move providers for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fair to say that there is going to be some sort of a common definition of what Drupal actually is, and it feels like the operator and controller pattern's the way to go. So basically, for those joining a little late, Jason was just defining the potential benefits of looking at a set of API resources that anyone can run an open source operator and controller of, that kind of defines what Drupal is. And for me, I think that has a lot of benefit, kind of both ways, because here's another just random quick link that I think Jeff was starting to put together by tagging issues in Drupal that are related to issues that different providers are going to eventually run into, and even people that are hosting or running their own clusters. And if we can, nice, if we can basically, kind of start solving these problems collectively, we're doing a lot of good for a lot of people. So really, I know that there's a lot of people that are very opinionated on how these problems should be handled, and I'm not quite sure really how to navigate it. So really the point of this meeting is just to say hi and start thinking about what this group could potentially do, or what this group should do. And I know that as an organization, we're pretty dedicated to helping put as much as we can into making this work. So, yeah. Did you have anything else to add, Jason?
No, I think that's at least my my 2 cents there. I see a few others on the call there, so I don't want to monopolize the floor there. not sure if anyone maybe has some thoughts about what I said in particular.
Yeah, no, one of the things that you had mentioned was the move towards Kubernetes. Two or so years ago is when I first started looking into it seriously. Last year was the first time I started building actual stuff on it. But in that time, it's kind of ridiculous how quickly a lot of like cloud providers, software as a service, those kind of things started picking it up. And it's kind of cool because for the first time since forever, there's like a new technology that is a standardized way of doing things. And at this point, it is kind of the Wild West in terms of, especially for Drupal, but for a lot of different web applications. Like I'm also deeply involved in some Magento projects. And on Magento, if you think Drupal is difficult or horrible or the community has issues, you've never worked with Magento, definitely. But a lot of the problems are similar. And the more we can solve some of those problems and have some best practices, or even make it so the code base itself, so that Drupal itself is really easy to run as a quote unquote 12-factor app, basically an app that is easy to run in Kubernetes or in Docker or wherever you want. That's going to be, it'll continue that kind of tradition of Drupal doing some really awesome things that other communities can emulate and pick up on, which I think would be a big win for us as people who are involved in Drupal, either hosting or running sites or whatever, but also would continue to kind of increase Drupal's visibility in the wider PHP community and maybe other communities as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point there. Adapting Drupal to run, in the new cloud native paradigm, getting Drupal, at least the web container, to where it's stateless and follows some of those better practices, it would be a massive win just for the community. Because yes, I mean this is rapidly moving towards being the de facto way to deploy applications in general. So even for users who aren't thinking too much about Kubernetes right now may be challenged with this at a very inconvenient time. I think maybe a comparison there could be, so users who aren't very proactive about making sure that they're keeping their code base and PHP version up to date and wait until the end of life or the 6 month after end of life part for it to be a crisis and react to it rather than be proactive there. I know a big topic, at least from my perspective of running Drupal effectively on Kubernetes, has been the file storage. The file storage component has been, at least from the biggest pain point I've experienced, just in how limiting it can be.
Yeah, I actually just got off a meeting where we spent about an hour talking about that particular problem. We're using EFS for what we're currently building, and it's working pretty good. It's a little slow sometimes for certain things, but we're in AWS. If you're not in AWS, you don't have EFS, and you might have to use something else.
Yeah, so like for us, the current platform of DW Live is also making use of EFS, and we've had problems with it as well. Some things that seem to indicate, it's that's NFS. We've been working on an implementation that's now using the new Google File Store, so their equivalent of it. But yeah, NFS is quite limiting. And if you want to run more than one pod, of course, you either have to, if you don't want NFS, you have to choose Gluster or SethFS at that point.
We haven't, like, we were running 3 replicas, and then it can scale up to 10, and we're using EFS, and it hasn't really showed any issues there.
Yeah, the problem hasn't been the scaling. Like when we add more containers, it will be just some of the limitations around how NFS and the type of operations you may do. Some of this can be owed to bad practice, but one of the things has been like, people that, users that put 1,000 files in the same directory and want to be able to list it out constantly. There's quite a bit of overhead to doing things like that.
Yeah. You just need to tell your users to not do stupid things. That's the problem that all these cloud hosting providers always have, is the users. The problem is always the users, of course. But
Always.
yeah. One thing that we did talk about in our meeting that I just had was something I'd heard of before but never really looked into, but Portworks. I don't know if you've investigated that much, but I believe they might be a paid product, but I think that they have some way of using like EBS-backed volumes, or in Google Cloud volumes, or whatever they're called, and using those shared some other protocol besides NFS that's supposedly way faster. I don't know about that, but it was something that I was definitely like, ooh, that would be really cool if that actually works really well.
Brian, you've actually worked with Portworks quite a bit, right?
Yeah. On the hosting platform that I worked on previously, they used Portworks, and I could say towards the end of my time there, the goal was to get off of Portworks, and it was a paid service, and we were utilizing their support and their engineers as much as possible. And I mean, Portworx specifically was the cause of numerous outages, but I guess the scale of the platform was pretty large. I mean, it was something like 10 or 20,000 sites by the time I left.
So you're saying that their marketing, as with the marketing from every one of these companies, is not 100% true. Judging by their marketing, it's like all of your problems will be solved.
If it's on the internet, it's probably true.
Silver bullets exist. You need to find them.
Yeah, I mean that's the difficulty, that like NFS is usually the simplest, but it's also in some situations the slowest, unless you can really lock down the types of sites you run, and they only upload small files, and they don't do a ton of stuff, and their themes don't have zillions of twig files. So it's like that's the slowest but easiest, and can work in some use cases. Gluster and Ceph are both a little faster, but still not like, you're never going to approach like same system disk speed, but they're a little faster, but they're more complex operationally. And then there's like the hosted solutions. The hardest thing is like, I believe on Google Cloud, the disk can be write many, but on AWS, the EBS volumes cannot have more than one pod write to it. So automatic EBS is excluded from use.
As a general rule of thumb, I have yet to find a block storage backed device, at least where you're directly doing block storage and it's being mounted that way onto the host, where it supports read write many. Typically, those ones are file system based ones.
Yeah, that stinks.
I think Azure comes the closest on that, on their cloud, of having like a block storage that has read write many.
Oh, that'd be nice.
Azure, you said?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. All right, well, now
It's one of those situations where you do wish for bare metal, because I envy the speed you can get out of a SAN attached to Kubernetes.
Oh, that's
I just wonder, like, why doesn't AWS or Google or whoever have a SAN product where you could have like a SAN per cluster or something like that? Like EFS is basically that, but it's not a SAN, it's NFS, so it's slow. I don't know.
That's a good question. I think EFS was meant to sort of fill that gap, but not be there completely. Rumor has it that EFS is backed by S3. I have not been able to confirm that, so that's not a fact. But it's explained some things that we've encountered with it. Not to mention, there's only so, you can only make that EFS perform so well, since they tie your I/O limits to your storage, the amount of stuff you're storing there.
Well, they actually do have, they now have provisioned access. So you can say, I want 20 megabits or 100 megabits, something like that. But the price for it is exactly the same as writing a like 1 terabyte file. So you can either have it auto expand performance with file size, or you can upfront pay for whatever speed you want, but you can't, there's no way to say like, give me burst capacity outside of writing larger files. I actually just had a separate conversation with our AWS rep, and a couple interesting tidbits for anybody that does use EFS or wants to. I think there's a hard limit per file system of 7,000 IOPS total for the file system. So even if you mount it to like 3,000 servers, and I'm not 100% sure on that. It might be per server, per like actual physical network interface connection, but it might be for the entire volume, and that's not a heck of a lot. So if you're writing thousands of files to it, it's going to be slow, and that's been our experience.
Yeah, and with customers wanting to, or with users wanting to do large uploads and downloads, balancing that with serving web traffic, there's a lot of work that then needs to happen there to make sure that a couple of large imports or something like that won't bring like a shared EFS, cause a disruption to those actual sites just trying to serve traffic. That's where I think the point that I think we've all kind of arrived at, or the point that I think a lot of us are going to, is making sure that object storage has first-class support in Drupal. I think I've seen this problem more in the WordPress community, but I think one of the things that could make that challenging is the plugins. Whether or not plugins are, expecting to be able to do stuff to the local file system.
It's gotten better. That's for sure. Like I've used S3FS on Drupal on 4 site builds in the past 3 years. The first one, we were basically shooting ourselves in the foot like every day on it. We still needed it for one thing, but it screwed up so many different things. But as time goes on, like we've submitted some patches to some modules that weren't working with it correctly. And one of those modules was actually Honeypot. And then we, I think through that process, that module, even though it's like alpha 12, which it really should be like beta at this point, it was working pretty well on the last couple of sites I built. But we were kind of strict about only using it for certain types of file uploads.
Is it really just for the larger stuff that it's being uploaded and it will be kind of served as is to web traffic?
Yeah, mostly that. One of the sites we used S3 as the file system for basically all public files. And it worked, but certain things in Drupal were a little slower. Like after a cache clear, writing all the new, like I guess it writes some PHP files and the CSS and JS and all that. It was similar performance to EFS, which again leads to your theory, which I do not know, is where is EFS backed? And if it's backed by S3, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. Yeah, for like precompiled files, temporary block storage and stuff like that can work better. It's just about the trouble I have, and full disclosure, I personally don't have a multi-year sort of background working, building sites in Drupal or working on the core of it. I'm a cloud guy. systems developer sort of guy. Originally was in Java. So the thing, at least from someone who's kind of coming from the outside, getting, learning so much more about this ecosystem, is it just, at times it feels like you don't know which things on which part of the file system is going to be more sensitive to disk latency and IO latency than others. To your point there.
Cool. So just reeling it back in a little bit. I mean, I really don't know what the outcome of this conversation is going to be. I was kind of thinking that, in an ideal scenario, that it ends up formulating into some type of a regular workspace or conversation, so some way that we can start surfacing maybe some of the Drupal issues that need to be looked at to solve some of these problems, or quite a few people seem interested in getting some type of a common CRD definition in place. So I guess I just really open that up to the group. I mean, what do we want to do with this?
I think one thing is I do like having a little unstructured talking time if we want to make this kind of a regular meeting, kind of like, and we do this at our local Drupal meetup too. We always have some time for someone pops in and like, man, I tried doing this and it just didn't work. That can be really helpful and also attract people who are not super deep into it already, and get newer people to come in. I like having this agenda because one of the things that I am very interested in is that CRD, because at Acquia we are very strongly looking into this area. I don't know what more I can say, but basically if we had a CRD and if it was something that we could use and contribute to, that would be awesome. There's some culture shifts that have to happen to make something like that happen, but I'm pushing for it. But even outside of that, I am starting to rebuild some of my projects to use Kubernetes in the CI, so that I can push the containers out to my production servers, which are using Kubernetes, which is really easy and cheap on DigitalOcean. And it'd be really cool to make that simpler and make it so you can have a scalable Drupal site or a simple Drupal site, really quick and easy inside of Kubernetes. But to that point too, some of those issues that you linked under Brad Jones 1 in the gist, some of those would not only help with Kubernetes, but it would help with so many other things too, Lando and other local development environments could be made to be more efficient and faster Drupal setup and all those things if we could get some of those things done.
Right. Well, that's a huge benefit of this, is we open that landscape completely. If there's a common interface about what it takes to host Drupal, then the local development environment should be able to realize benefits in the same way that the hosting provider should be able to realize benefits.
Yeah, you don't have to use the local tools. Your local tool set isn't going to make you feel hamstrung by your hosting provider and vice versa. That would be a big win, especially for just the user base in general.
Yes.
There may be folks that can't use some of the container-based solutions out there, like Lando, DDEV, for whatever reason. Maybe they're running Windows 7 still. Being able to still have a tool set, or be able to have tooling that can go against that common interface, I think gives that flexibility to the user to be flexible with a local environment. And at least with users we've talked to who have a preferred hosting provider, cannot always use that hosting provider for a particular client. So that interoperability, I think, is just everyone's, I think, is going to benefit from it, and the hosting providers have plenty of other things to be able to compete over. That doesn't require having 100% proprietary APIs for everything on each platform.
Okay, so I guess really the only agenda item that I had listed as a question here is, where should we start this conversation? Where should this conversation be focused? Should it be a project on Drupal.org? Should it be a project on GitHub, or should it be the Slack channel? I'm not quite sure where the right place to focus this conversation is. So currently, I'm just going to put this particular video out on YouTube and just keep asking the question until we have a more formal home. So again, I put that out to the group to see if anybody has any ideas.
I think that's good. One thing to think about too is maybe, I think we have two, in some ways I almost want to change this to, the cloud native sort of SIG.
Yeah.
For Drupal. So the focus is on, we focus on topics around making Drupal run on in a cloud native environment, and there's sort of like two sub areas there. Things that may need to happen with the Drupal core and plugin, custom module ecosystem. Even if there's things out there like creating an analysis tool that can look at a Drupal module and report on whether it can meet certain conditions that make it run successfully in a cloud native environment. And then the second part is more focused on the infrastructure stuff as you will. Patterns for efficiently running Drupal on Kubernetes and whatever comes after Kubernetes through the cloud native foundation.
And by default, is that a GitHub repository that we'd create to have issues and kind of an agenda put forth, or a mission statement?
It's an interesting question. Like Drupal has usually not really had SIGs in the sense that the Kubernetes community has. And so there's not really any formality. Usually it's often like, oh, we have a Slack channel, or, oh, there's a Google Doc. So I don't know. It would be interesting to have a GitHub repo, because then we have issue tracker. We could even throw some different bits of code in there or use the wiki or something.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I think having things like if you look at API conventions, tracking things even in Markdown, doing that in GitHub allows anyone to be able to offer a pull request proposing new standards and changes in convention. So I really do like that workflow and GitHub idea there.
Okay. Well, that's really kind of the main question for this particular meeting. So I didn't mean to interrupt the casual conversation and encourage it to continue. I'll just get out of the way for a little bit.
No problem. I think if we want to make this a sustainable initiative, there has to be a little bit of formality around it anyways. Like maybe for these meetings, if we wanted to start with a few agenda topic items and time box them or something, and then get into more free-form conversation, that might be nice. Because I know today is a fun day where I am literally in meetings from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. So, but I was very happy to jump out of them to talk here. But I did want to make sure that, if there's some other things in this agenda that we wanted to at least hit on, if we wanted to hit on those before closing up, because
Sure. And we can go through the list. There's I don't believe representation from the people that suggested them, so I'll do my best. And I know that Athom, Athom, I'm not sure how to actually pronounce that, had an implementation of an operator that was, I believe, backed by Ansible, that he put out there, and I was hopeful that he'd be able to talk a little bit about it, because he also had some ideas about using Kind, I believe, as a bit of a testing infrastructure to be able to validate the work. Can anybody speak to that?
Let me look at that.
I've been following along with the Ansible Operator work a little bit, and it's interesting because the whole point of it is Ansible is managed by Red Hat, who also manages OpenShift, and OpenShift is basically Kubernetes with some layers on top of it. So Ansible itself has OpenShift support, which is basically Kubernetes. Therefore, there's a lot of initiative for Red Hat. It's in their best interest to make their tools work together. So Ansible actually has pretty robust support for managing Kubernetes in a variety of different ways. So that logically it followed, hey, let's make an Ansible operator so you can write playbooks to manage CRDs instead of writing like Go applications or whatever language you want.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how that's set up. And it's, if you know Go, you're like, this is stupid. Why would I ever use Ansible operator? But it is kind of cool as somebody who, I do not know a whole lot of Go, just enough to like tweak something or fix a bug. Being able to write an operator fully with just the Ansible knowledge I have is kind of cool. But I think that's how that one works, and it's not super flexible right now the way he has it written. I think that's more of a POC type thing for him right now, but it could be molded into something nice. Or I mean, just the CRD itself. It doesn't matter if we have his operator based on Ansible or some other operator. But if we had a good CRD, you could swap in a different operator if you wanted, or if we wanted to standardize on one that's written in Go, or heck, you could write one in PHP. I don't know how, well, I know how you would do it.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I know how you would do it. I don't know necessarily why you would do it that way, but.
Yeah, I think I think that's a good spot that's where, starting with the API definitions would be the first real big win there, and we can talk through then writing implementations for those APIs in some sort of language. There has been a more movement towards building in the first class support for languages other than Go for the Cube client. That guy from Microsoft, Michael. Anyways, has been pretty passionate about this. And so the Ansible operator makes a lot of sense for someone who is trying to get a lot done and doesn't want to learn not only Go, but also everything that has to do with either, there's three options. Use the older controller runtime directly, like the first generation operators were. Prometheus operator, I think, is a good example of one that started very early and is doing this. Or using like the Cube Builder SD or the Red Hat, I guess I can call it the IBM now, SDK that Red Hat, of course, pushes. And both require Go, as well as some pretty significant knowledge too around things like the controller runtime and things like that. Another option that I think could be passable, and this may be interesting for the non-Go developers, is to use the Meta controller. It's a webhook-based one from. It's part of the Google Cloud Platform GitHub org. I'll put a link in the Kubernetes Slack channel to it. But it does offer the ability to register a controller, if you will, to a webhook that you can write in any language. And that may be something that's compelling to look at, a lower barrier to entry, especially for an open source implementation. So we internally have been, we're a heavy Go shop and are using Cube Builder. But when I thought about the open source, how to get this open source, that has been a question on my mind, especially for a Drupal developer who wants to contribute and help. There would be a very large learning curve there. So I think that's something I think we should think about. We don't have to solve it right now.
Right, and there's some good questions in the chat, specifically on whether or not we should use GitLab or GitHub to host some of the issues. So I don't know, does anybody want to maybe pose that question and talk about it a little bit?
I mean, the coolest thing would be if Drupal.org got to stage 2 or stage 3 of GitLab migration. We could do it all there, and we would have all the GitLab fanciness with the hosted Drupal.org one. But otherwise, I mean, in my perspective, it's just the main thing would be a central resource. I initially was thinking like a README file with like, here's links to this, here's links to that, here's what we're looking at.
Yep.
And then issues for new things or PRs for adding to that. But if we wanted to have like, and here's a way to implement something or code examples and things, that maybe changes the discussion a little bit.
So that's a question I have. Does anyone know any or have a background on like what like the core Drupal team governance? What is the opinion of GitHub? Is it the devil? We don't want anything that's part of like the community. Avoid putting community projects on GitHub for a particular reason. I'm just curious. So,
well, the project itself has moved over to GitLab, and GitLab I think is generally seen as a little bit more open source friendly. So the more that we can continue to support that, I think the better overall. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I mean the flip side to that equation, like Drupal.org is definitely switching over to it, but if you're talking about GitLab.com versus GitHub.com, the situation there is more of a question of, like I think I have an account on GitLab.com, but it's probably been 5 years since I logged into it. Like there's just an order of magnitude less activity on GitLab.com versus GitHub.
Right.
So fewer users are already on it, and fewer users might. It's kind of like Slack, in my opinion. Well, that war has already been lost, I guess. But like you have to be on Slack and in Slack, and you have to add the organization. So like I'm looking at my sidebar, and I have 15 of these things, and it's rare that I click on any besides my work one because it's just too much. You click on it, then it waits 12 seconds to load, and then your RAM goes up by like 3,000 megabytes. Back in the old days of IRC, it was very, very simple, but we're engineers more than fancy end users who love flashy things.
Well, go ahead, Jason.
I like the simplicity of IRC. It's been so long since I've used it. Yeah, that's something I know that generally in the open source communities, there was that big backlash around the Microsoft acquisition. So I'm trying to figure out how much because I came especially more in the corporate enterprise space that wasn't involved directly in IT, but was using IT services. GitHub in particular had everything was around data sovereignty, data, ownership of data. So I was trying to see also too if there were some concerns around that with GitHub or
I think our purpose is for this group, we can start on GitHub and go ahead and just generate kind of a synopsis of this meeting, maybe outline a couple of items that might be considered next steps. And then if we need to, we can open up discussion about moving it someplace else. Does that sound reasonable? Cool.
I think that's reasonable.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we're coming up to the top of the hour. So unless anybody has anything else that they'd like to add, I think we can wrap up.
Just say thanks a lot, everyone. It's just been a fly on the wall here, but it's been great hearing all the energy and ideas. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time, and we'll get this summarized, and I'll add links into the Drupal Slack.
All right.
Thanks, guys.